Successful organizations have long understood that learning from experience is one of the best ways to get better, and I think that's what we're trying to do here. It's the longest part of the report. It's a detailed description of what happened and what did not happen during the over 35 months between the beginning of the investigation in November 2008 and the filing of charges against Sandusky in November 2011. For organizational purposes, the report divides the investigation into 4 phases. And those are in a separate section in Part 1. Part 1, Section A, summarizes the first phase, which ran from the initial report by Victim 1 in 2008 until the referral of the case to the Office of Attorney General in March 2009. Again, that predated OAG's involvement in the case, but there are important lessons to be learned from that part of it. And again, the Attorney General made it clear to me when I started that she wanted me to start then, when Victim 1 made his first complaint.
It took incredible courage for Aaron Fisher to reveal the most painful secret in his life, that Jerry Sandusky, the revered football legend, is a monster. They went to CYS, Child Youth Services. Aaron told just the least bit of what he had endured to psychologist Mike Gillum.
It was obvious to me immediately that he was very upset that something had in fact happened to him.
His agency also notified the state police, which launched an investigation. It seemed Sandusky was about to get arrested.
Usually one cop comes, does the interview, and within days to a month or so, there's going to be an arrest.
Yes.
But that didn't happen. Gillum says it seemed Jerry Sandusky was given the benefit of the doubt at every turn. Prosecutors said they needed more victims to charge Sandusky. To Aaron, it meant his suffering wasn't enough.
He's going to be arrested on this date to this date, okay? This date to this date comes, nothing.
And the whole time, Jerry's out there.
Yeah, he's not even in jail.
Randy Feathers was the lead investigator on Aaron's case.
Help me with this, Mr.
Sure.
Feathers. You say you knew this guy was a pedophile.
Absolutely.
And you leave him out there for years. How many kids may he have molested during that time?
Well, we did do some precautions. I mean, obviously, we did some surveillance.
But you know for sure that he never molested another kid during the years?
Of course not. I mean, it's not a perfect world. We did the best we could.
That's not that the best you could would have been an arrest.
Not true.
The second phase of the investigation is summarized in Part B, or Section B. It began in March 2009 when the Office of Attorney General got the case from the Center County District Attorney's Office, and ended in March 2010 when the assigned prosecutor, Janelle Eschbach, submitted a draft presentment to her supervisors suggesting that the case be charged then with a single victim. This phase, again discussed in Section B, includes the decision to submit the investigation to the grand jury. It includes a discussion of Victim 1's testimony before the grand jury. He actually testified twice during this phase. And it discusses early efforts to corroborate Victim 1. It also discusses investigative steps that were considered but not taken during this time, such as searching Sandusky's residence and going to the local Children and Youth Agency and asking whether there were other allegations against Sandusky. Those are things considered in 2009 but not undertaken. By the end of 2009, we get to the end of 2009, and the investigation has not identified any other victims. We just have Victim 1. And Eschbach, again, the assigned prosecutor, decided it was time to draft charges based on that one victim that they had. And she does that. In the third phase of the investigation, which is described in Section C of Part 1, it ran from March 2010, when Eschbach submitted her draft presentment to her supervisors, until the receipt of a tip about Mike McQueary, which came in November 2010. And Eschbach's draft presentment, if you're looking for it, is in Appendix F of the report. Now, this is a time period, again, this phase of the investigation, it's a time period when the recovery of email was particularly helpful in terms of understanding what happened. You'll see as you look at the emails that Eschbach sent a series of messages, a series of emails to her bosses, often after hearing from Victim 1's mother or psychologist, asking about or looking for an answer to whether or not she could charge the case based on that single victim. The answer she got, which was no, eventually came in August of 2000, 5 months after she first submitted her draft. And again, in the report, Appendix G contains a set of emails, which I think are interesting reading, that run from the submission of the draft presentment to the answer, no, we're not going to go forward. Now, those are all contained in Appendix G. That decision, the decision in 2010 not to charge, based on the evidence available at the time, was made by then Attorney General Corbett. It was based on the collective advice of the people above Ms. Eschbach in the chain of command, all of whom apparently disagreed with her assessment. They all recommended to then Attorney General Corbett that the case not go forward at that time. Their view, as they explained it to me, and as they explained it at the time, was that victim one's testimony needed additional support in the form of other victims before the case could go forward. So what happened during that 5 months that the investigation, that the presentment was being considered? Well, unfortunately, during that time, the investigation was at a complete standstill. During those 5 months, March to August 2010, no witnesses were interviewed, no subpoenas were issued. And for the next 2+ months after that, no one new was interviewed, and the investigation did not succeed in identifying any new victims. So we get to the early November 2010, and as Eschbach put it when she was interviewed, the investigation was dead in the water at that time. Then on November 3rd, the Center County District Attorney, Stacey Parks Miller, received an email saying that investigators should talk to Mike McQueary, that he had information that was relevant to the investigation. And that email, which is in Appendix J, was the beginning of what the report describes as the 4th phase of the investigation. That phase ran from the McQueary tip, November 2000, through the filing of charges almost exactly 1 year later. So that McQueary tip, along with another important discovery that occurred right around the same time, which was the discovery of the 1998 allegations against Sandusky. Those two things together fundamentally changed the course of the investigation. From January 2011 through the filing of charges in November and December 2011, the investigation was now both wide-ranging and aggressive. Investigators and prosecutors conducted hundreds of interviews. They identified more Sandusky victims, and they investigated the conduct of Penn State administrators. The grand jury issued over 100 subpoenas during that time. It met on 18 separate occasions, as compared to just twice in 2010. And it heard the testimony of more than 50 witnesses, again, as compared to just two witnesses in 2010. This section of the report, rather than trying to cover in detail all of that activity, it's just not possible in a report of reasonable length to talk in detail about all the things that happened in 2011. What we did instead is summarize the most important activity during that time by month. So there's summaries by month. For more detail, you can look at the timeline at the end of the report, which details the investigative steps more fully. You'll see when you look at that timeline in Part 4 that in some single months in 2011, more investigative activity took place than in all of 2009 or in all of 2010. Part 1 ends by describing the run-up to the charging of Sandusky in November 2011 and then the filing of additional charges in December against him after more victims came forward at that time. All right, that brings us to Part 2, second major part of the report, and that begins on page 91. And what Part 2 does is it addresses the central issues raised by the events that occurred and did not occur in Part 1. And those issues are addressed in 7 sections. It's A through G. Most of those, but not all of them, most of them have to do with the question of why did it take as long as it did to bring charges. So Section A of Part 2 discusses the initial report by the Keystone Central School District to Clinton County CYS, which again occurred in November 2008, the day after Victim 1 first brought the allegations to the attention of folks at his school. And the focus in Section A is whether the district complied with its reporting obligations under Pennsylvania law. There's a lot of controversy about that, largely in the area of the school district, and so we wanted to address those questions. Here we worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Education that was conducting its own preliminary investigation based on media reports. We worked with them, and the bottom line is, despite important areas for improvement in the school district's handling of the matter, the report concludes, as did PDE, that the district and its officials substantially complied with their obligations under the law. Section B of Part 2 looks at the actions of Clinton County children and youth and law enforcement between the time of victim one's first report and the time the case got referred to the Office of Attorney General. And here again, important lessons to be learned. So while Clinton County COAS treated victim one with skill and care, there's no doubt about that, the level of coordination between COAS and its law enforcement partners was less than ideal. For example, despite the mandate of Pennsylvania's Child Protective Services law, no multidisciplinary investigative teams were convened by anyone involved. Neither district attorney nor anyone else convened an investigative team, even though that's what the law appears to mandate. Just as important, Sandusky was interviewed by COAS without the participation of a criminal investigator, without anybody from the district attorney's office, anybody from the Pennsylvania State Police. And that was a significant missed opportunity, because law enforcement never got a chance later to interview Sandusky. That was the one chance, and unfortunately, it didn't happen. Why does that matter? The folks at COAS did a commendable job in conducting the interview, but their focus is not on a later criminal investigation. Their focus is on child safety and deciding whether the report was indicated or not within the meaning of the law. Professional trained investigators, had they participated, almost certainly would have gotten more valuable information out of Sandusky, either in the form of admissions or leads for other victims or additional information for a search warrant. Again, the interview went well, and it played an important role in the Sandusky trial, but had criminal investigators been involved, it would have likely been better. Again, the important thing, again, there's some dispute in the responses you'll see about who was responsible for that failure to have law enforcement participate. The bottom line, the important thing, though, is that interagency cooperation in this area has to be seamless, or it has to be seamless in these cases. And more specifically, when an alleged perpetrator is being interviewed, even if it's part of the child protective process, it's very important to get law enforcement involved at that time. Sticking with this phase, still, there was another crucial missed opportunity in 2009. As you all know, back in 1998, the Center County DA's office was involved in an investigation of Sandusky based on similar allegations. Obviously, new DA, new personnel there, but there was institutional knowledge within the Center County DA's office about that 1998 investigation. So we get to 2009, the case is being transferred from the Center County DA's office to the Office of Attorney General, and the fact that those 98 allegations existed was not passed on. Nobody at the Attorney General's office, nobody at the Pennsylvania State Police was told about those earlier allegations. Why that did not happen is a great question, and it is not entirely clear. It was most likely, I think, an unfortunate failure of communication. There are different people with different recollections at the time. But again, the bottom line, investigators did not learn about those 98 allegations until more than a year and a half later. And had they known about them at the beginning, they certainly would have found other victims much more quickly than they did.
Law enforcement, Attorney General Tom Corbett and Congressman Glenn Thompson agree. On Election Day, Center County needs to re-elect proven crime fighter Michael Madera, District Attorney.
Okay, moving forward to the time the case gets to the Office of Attorney General, the issue of the grand jury. Part 2, Section C addresses the use of the grand jury to investigate Sandusky. Both Eschbach and her supervisors, all the way up to the Attorney General at the time, they all believed that the advantages of the grand jury, mostly in terms of subpoena power, requirement of oath, secrecy of the investigation, that they all supported its use to investigate Sandusky. Of course, had the plan been to charge Sandusky right away, which other prosecutors might reasonably have pursued, right, there would have been little need for the grand jury. But that was not the plan. That was not the plan. The plan was not to charge right away. The plan was to investigate, and so the decision was made to use the grand jury. And so the report concludes that, again, while many prosecutors might have taken a different path here, they might have decided differently and quite reasonably, the decision to use a grand jury in this case was within the bounds of reasonable prosecutorial discretion. The report also concludes that given the decision not to charge right away, the use of the grand jury did not by itself appear to slow the investigation. Again, once the decision is made not to charge, we're going to investigate, did the grand jury slow the investigation? And sometimes grand juries do. They can be cumbersome. They only meet in Pennsylvania, they meet once a month for a week. It can be difficult to schedule witnesses. We looked here, and the reasons for delay here, on the list of reasons for delay, or the list of reasons for why the investigation took as long as it did. The use of the grand jury is not high on that list. Right? They didn't have trouble scheduling witnesses, et cetera.
A thorough investigation takes time. It takes time to find witnesses.
The real problem is really quite the opposite at some level, and that is for long stretches of time before the investigation was ramped up in 2011, the resources of the grand jury were barely used at all. In 2010, for example, from the beginning of January through the end of October, okay, right before the McQueary tip, the grand jury issued no subpoenas for testimony, and it issued only one for records. In contrast, you look at 2011, for that same time period, January to October 2011, the grand jury issued more than 50 subpoenas for testimony and more than 50 subpoenas for records. Electoral politics. One of the big questions, obviously, that's been asked ever since Sandusky was first charged is whether Governor Corbett, while Attorney General, intentionally slowed the pace of the investigation for some electoral advantage. And in fact, a long period of delay in getting an answer in 2010, that March to August delay, led some people within the investigation to speculate that, or at least to ask that question. Led some people within the investigation to ask the question, was politics involved? It was, after all, an election year, and the Attorney General was running for governor. But despite that internal speculation, we looked very closely at everything that we could on this subject, talked to everybody we could on this subject. The report explains that we found no direct evidence that electoral politics influenced any important decision made in the investigation. And again, the report finds that we found no direct evidence that electoral politics influenced any important decision made in the investigation. In fact, there's nothing in the documentary record or witness interviews to suggest that then Attorney General Corbett gave any instructions at all about how to conduct the investigation of Sandusky. He did obviously make the decision not to charge in August, but other than that, at an operational level, he said and others said that he wasn't making those decisions. Those were all happening below him in the chain of command.
And I was in contact with him on a regular basis. How's it coming? How's it coming? Keep moving, pushing. You tell me when you're ready.
Resources. Section E of the report discusses whether the assignment of additional resources earlier in the investigation would have resulted in the earlier filing of charges. And it's true, if you look at the timeline, you can't help but see this, right? It is true that in 2011 there was a significant increase both in investigative resources and in the pace and the scope of the investigation. But if you look at how most victims were identified, and the report does go through that in fair amount of detail, how was each victim identified in the investigation, you'll see that the identification of victims cannot be closely linked to a lack of resources or to the infusion of additional resources. And the best leads in late 2010 and early 2011, again, which led to the identification of 4 victims and 2 other incidents, they were entirely unrelated to new resources. Also, it appears that no investigative steps were considered and then skipped and delayed because of a lack of resources. And would more resources have helped? Sure, right? But only if they had been deployed to do the things that needed to be done. Should Sandusky have been charged earlier? Section F of the report takes on that question. And why are we asking that question? Why does that matter now that he's in prison for the rest of his life, or likely for the rest of his life? Well, timeliness is important in all criminal investigations, but it's especially important in child sexual abuse investigations. And why is that? That's because experience tells us and the research tells us that serial child molesters are significantly more likely than other offenders to continue their behavior, right? Even if they know that they're being investigated. So the comfort we might have in other investigations. Well, we haven't charged yet, but the target knows we're investigating him, so he's unlikely to be continuing to offend. That does not necessarily apply when we're talking about these preferential serial child molesters.
Did it weigh on your mind that there might have been more victims out there as the
Absolutely. You mean that he could be victimizing? Yeah, I was worried about it. But at the same time, I believe he had to know we were looking at him at some point in time. And so if you know that they're looking at you, you kind of back away.
Now, before the Sandusky, obviously the case existed, the investigation existed for a period of time before it came to the Office of Attorney General. And before it came, and that was in March 2009, before that, neither the Clinton County District Attorney nor the Center County District Attorney had seriously considered filing charges. And that's because neither of them really considered the case on the merits before sending it on to its next stop. The Clinton County District Attorney had a familial conflict of interest. The Center County District Attorney had a familial conflict of interest, and that's why he sent the case to OAG. Before that, the Clinton County District Attorney saw the basic facts and saw that most of the conduct occurred in Center County, not Clinton County, and so he had sent it to the Center County District Attorney. What Section F of the report does is it focuses on the one point in the investigation when prosecutors did seriously consider bringing charges, and that was that March to August 2010 time period, when Eschbach submitted and her supervisors considered a draft presentment with victim 1 as the sole victim. Now, if you take as a given the state of evidence at the time, and that's a single victim with relatively modest corroboration, and a community icon as a possible defendant, again, taking the evidence as it was at the time, then the decision not to charge fit within acceptable bounds of prosecutorial discretion, even though other prosecutors, and most notably Janelle Eschbach, would have decided differently.
Why is one child rape victim or alleged victim not enough?
It could be enough. And if it were a non-celebrity, yeah, maybe. But the best thing you can do when you're talking about a child saying an adult is doing something that is this horrific to me, and he's a coach, you want to corroborate it. You build those cases as well as you can.
But there's one major problem with that premise, that is taking the evidence as it existed at the time. And that's that had the investigators been more aggressive, and we'll talk about this in a couple minutes, had they taken the investigative steps that they could have taken in 2009 and in 2010 that they didn't take until 2011, they almost certainly would have had much more evidence by the summer of 2010, and so that decision would have been a lot easier. Right? As it was one about which reasonable minds differed because of the state of the evidence. But had they worked and done the things earlier in the investigation that they could and should have, in 2010, they would have had a much stronger case, a case that looked a lot more like the case they had in 2011. I want to mention one other point about that 2010 decision point. Senior leadership at the Office of Attorney General, they had a line prosecutor who wanted to file charges. Her bosses, though, up the chain of command, they all believed that the case was too weak to charge based on one victim, and they all believed that there were likely more victims out there. That was a premise from very early on, that this was not a single incident involving victim 1, but that Sandusky hadn't fit the profile of somebody who was likely to have offended on many occasions with many victims.
But it was a calculated risk, not one that you really easily want to take.
So what happened in 2010, the decision, again, reasonable minds can differ about that decision whether to charge or not, but during the time that that they were considering the decision, and for several months thereafter, there really was no concerted effort to go find more victims, and that's puzzling in retrospect.
Governor, what's your message? Decided when you were the Attorney General not to press charges against Sandusky in that initial.
Say that again.
When you were Attorney General and the case from Clinton County came to your desk, can you talk about why you decided to look at a more broad case instead of charging him on that one right away?
Well, no, I'm not going to comment on that, but I would comment about it. And I think you all need to understand how investigations work. You get information, you get a case referred to you, you begin to take a look at a case, and I'm not speaking of this case, and you develop witnesses. Harold, you know this. You develop witnesses, and you go from one witness to the next, and you continue to build a case. Oftentimes it leads you to places you never would have imagined that it would lead you to. So, I mean, oftentimes it takes quite a bit of time.
Okay, why did the Sandusky investigation take as long as it did? That's what the Attorney General said. That's the central question. All the questions sort of revolve around that question. And the final section of Part 2, which is Section G, addresses that overarching question. And if you're looking for a fairly quick synopsis of the answer, or really multiple answers to that question, you may want to start with Section G, which begins on page 122 of the report. Okay, given the decision at the beginning not to charge Sandusky based on victim 1 as the sole victim, questions about the investigation's length come down to why it took so long to find additional victims. That's the central question. And this report discusses several significant factors that contributed to that. Those include, first, miscommunication at the outset. We talked about that already. Second, the requirement under Pennsylvania law that child abuse allegations deemed unfounded must be expunged within a certain period of time. Now, that's apparently what happened with the 1998 allegations. Those allegations were referred to the Department of Public Welfare. They were considered by the district attorney at the time in Center County. The case was not charged at the time. Again, that's a subject beyond the scope of this report.
Ray Griecar decided not to prosecute Jerry Sandusky. We don't know his reasons. It is easy now to second-guess Griecar's decision, especially since Jerry Sandusky allegedly went on to commit repeated assaults after 1998.
For those who say that Ray Griecar missed the opportunity to put Sandusky away, you say what?
I say they don't know the law, they don't know Ray Griecar.
There were online posts and tweets speculating about a link between the two. But could there actually be a connection?
For anybody to suggest otherwise is, I think, incredibly naive.
Dr. Cyril Wecht is a well-known forensic pathologist in Pittsburgh, about 100 miles west of Penn State. He has not worked on the Griecar case, but he has followed it for years. Wecht made news with his comments after the Sandusky story broke. He believes there must have been rumors Sandusky was continuing to abuse young boys after 1998, and he says Griecar must have heard them.
I guarantee you, after a district attorney has been in office for some years, there is not any kind of criminal activity that takes place in that county that he is not aware of.
Wecht speculates that Griecar blamed himself for those alleged abuses and either walked away or committed suicide. Or, Wecht says, maybe Griecar knew too much.
Someone says, Mr. Griecar, we've kept it quiet all this time, and without you around, we'll keep it quiet longer. And that's the end of Mr. Griecar.
But Griecar's friends and colleagues rule out any connection between the missing DA and the Sandusky case.
I am in no way aware of any reason why there would be a link.
But as a result of the case not being charged, then the record of those allegations had to be expunged from child line records. Right? And as a result, when the new allegations against Sandusky came in 2008 and 2009, a check of those records would have revealed no prior allegations. And so as a result of that, investigators, one of the reasons why investigators didn't learn about those 1990 allegations until later. And the third significant factor, sort of overarching factor as to why the investigation took as long as it did, was the failure to take certain steps earlier in the investigation that proved very valuable later on. Okay, what were those steps? The most significant of those steps, any one of which could have been taken in 2009 or 2010, were searching Sandusky's home, asking the local police about earlier investigations involving Sandusky. That's how they ended up getting the 1998 allegations or finding out about them, and questioning the local Children and Youth Service and the Second Mile about Sandusky as well. And again, the report talks about all of those decisions. I want to spend a minute or two now, though, on the subject of the search, because this is really, I think, an area where there's an important lesson to be learned, I hope. As one expert put it in a book written before Sandusky was charged, I'm going to quote, "The major law enforcement problem with the use of search warrants in child sexual victimization cases is that they are not obtained soon enough." Again, that's not written about Sandusky. That's written generally about these sorts of cases. Read that again. "The major law enforcement problem with the use of search warrants in child sexual victimization cases is that they are not obtained soon enough." And that was certainly the case in the Sandusky investigation. The search of Sandusky's residence did not occur until June 2011. Right? That's more than 2 years after the case got to the Office of Attorney General, and as you'll see from the report, it's more than 18 months after searching was suggested by an investigator in the case. Again, more than 2 years after the case came in, more than 18 months after an investigator suggested conducting the search. And when the search finally did happen, it uncovered unquestionably valuable evidence, including photographs of Sandusky victims and lists of second-mile campers with asterisks next to some of their names, asterisks that later turned out to line up with people that Sandusky had victimized. Had the search been conducted in 2009 or 2010, investigators could have used those photographs and could have used the names to find victims much earlier than they did. Now, why did the search not happen earlier? There are a number of reasons given, one of which was to keep the investigation secret. Another was a concern about the lack of probable cause or staleness. But the experts tell us that serial child molesters regularly maintain, in terms of staleness, which is the idea that months after a crime has occurred, it may be less likely that evidence of that crime is going to still exist at the location in question. So was it likely? And victim one's, I knew I was going to do that. Victim one's allegations were about conduct that ended in the fall of 2008. Right? The case doesn't come to the Office of Attorney General until March of 2009. So a number of months have passed. Is it now too late to conduct a search? Is the evidence stale? And the answer to that is no. The simple answer to that is no. And in fact, the evidence was not much fresher in 2011 than it was back in 2009. And that's because experts tell us that serial child molesters regularly maintain valuable evidence about their crimes, including items as simple as ordinary photographs of their victims, which is something that Sandusky did. Moreover, victim one described being abused in Sandusky's basement at his home and provided investigators with valuable and significant details about the layout of the home. If for no other reason, a search early on could have provided very useful corroboration for victim one's story, which is exactly what some people were saying they needed before they could charge, and yet the search didn't happen. Based on some of the responses to this report, some of the people involved apparently still think that they did not have probable cause back in 2009 or that the evidence was too stale. I completely disagree with that. Search warrants are properly issued every day based on the word of a single victim. If the idea that a single victim wasn't enough to get probable cause, that would be astonishing. Right? It's one thing to say that a single victim might not be enough to support a conviction. Right? Again, we talked about that. That's something that reasonable minds might differ about. But it is quite another thing, and I think quite wrong, to suggest that it's not enough for a search. Now, again, as for staleness, this issue of staleness was the information too old to justify a search? Well, it was too old in 2009. It would have been too old in 2011. Right? There's nothing in the search warrant affidavit, which is in the report as well. I don't remember the appendix number, but it's in the report. There's nothing in there about any victim victimized after victim one. There's no fresh information in that. But that doesn't matter. The search warrant was properly issued. Right? It was properly issued and not really vigorously challenged by Sandusky. And why is that? And that's because of the well-documented desire of multi-victim child molesters to hang on to evidence of their crimes, even when they're aware that an investigation is ongoing. And again, that fact can be used and should be used to defeat claims that a warrant was stale. Right? Again, this is an important lesson for anyone who works in this field. Search. I mean, there may be reasons not to search. Maybe you don't want to tip off the target that he's a target of investigation, but Sandusky had known for quite some time, by the time the case got to the Office of Attorney General, that he was a target, and yet the search didn't happen. Okay, now speaking of lessons, it's time for me to get close to stop talking. Speaking of lessons, Part 3, which begins on page 132, makes a series of recommendations to the Office of Attorney General based on the body of the report. Part 4, I already mentioned, is a timeline. It starts on page 142, and it consists of a detailed list of investigative steps and other significant events in the Sandusky investigation. And then I mentioned earlier, the back of the report, you see the last tab in the report is a tab marked responses. And those are responses from people who had the opportunity to view the report before it was published. I want to make clear that while we have provided those individuals with the opportunity to respond, and we've attached their responses out of fairness and out of convenience as well for everybody else, the views expressed in each response are those of the author of that response. The fact that they're appended to the report does not mean they're views that I agree with or the Office of Attorney General agrees with. Now, again, some changes were made to the report based on those responses. They are all marked clearly in the report. You'll see asterisk footnotes that mark where changes got made as a result of the responses. Okay. Before we get to your questions, I want to emphasize at the end here why I believe that this project was worthwhile. There are critics who say and have said that you shouldn't conduct a post-event review like this, or at least not publicly conduct one, when the underlying event was successful. And here there's no doubt that the final result, the final outcome was a success. Sandusky will almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. And I want to make sure we say that many people worked long and hard to produce that result, right? And many victims showed great courage in testifying and telling their stories. Those people all deserve both our admiration and our thanks. But even a highly successful final result does not mean that the investigation itself was a complete success, particularly when a serial child molester was left uncharged for so long. There are plenty of lessons to be learned from this investigation, from this prosecution, lessons that will help law enforcement, that will help Child Protective Services, and will even help members of the public understand better and do better in the future. I'd like to again thank Attorney General Kaine for giving me the opportunity to participate in this project and for providing me with the resources at OAG that I needed to complete it, particularly Laura Ditka and Dave Pfeiffer, who brought not only tremendous energy but also vast experience in this area to the table. And I also want to mention Braden Cook, who is a true computer forensic genius, and he was the one who enabled us to recover these emails, which I think are pretty important to telling the story. So that's all I have to say right now. I think we're going to open the floor for questions.
As a candidate, you said that you thought the delay that has now been documented was probably due to politics. Even though the report found no evidence of that, do you still believe that?
This report was a very fair and factual report, and as I said from the very beginning, we will leave no stone unturned, and I believe that's exactly what this report does. And I also said, where there is direct evidence, we will give it to you, whether it means that somebody did something or someone did not do something. That's exactly what this report accomplishes. This report found no direct evidence, no email, no confession, no statement from anybody indicating that they were told to slow this down because of politics. This report also shows long periods of inexcusable, and by inexcusable I mean that even the parties involved couldn't offer an excuse for the delays, and delays that quite honestly are unfathomable to most of us. Why those delays took place, we don't know the answer to that. We don't know what was in their head. They describe it as there was also tactical errors that were made that could have moved this case 2 years sooner, at least 2 years sooner than it was. And those are inexplainable. So where we have no direct evidence that politics played a part, we are giving you those factual basis. Where there is evidence that it just took too long, and why it took too long because of the delays. For example, the 5-month delay between March of 2010 until November of 2010 as to why the presentment sat on someone's desk and there was no answer given. We don't know why that happened.
Do you still believe it was politics?
I've always said from the very beginning, and I am a prosecutor through and through, and in a closing argument, it doesn't matter what our personal opinion is. I rely upon the facts, and the facts is there was no direct evidence, but there are questions of inexcusable delays. Why those delays took place, we don't know. There are questions of tactical errors that were made. Why were those tactical errors made? We don't know. And in that instance, we have to put it out to the public, and just like a jury, we have to say, you need to base your opinion upon the facts, and you need to rely upon your own personal experiences.
Does Governor Corbett deserve a public apology and his people, since it was found that this was not politically motivated?
What this report found is that there was no direct evidence that it was politically motivated. Like I said, we went through Jeff went through thousands and thousands and thousands of emails. The relevant portions are attached in the report. There was no confession and there was no statement. There are serious questions as to why those delays occurred. Why was there inactivity or virtual inactivity for almost 18 months? Why wasn't a search warrant issued in the beginning? Why did it sit on someone's desk? And for that, we can't answer.
Were they reckless, and should they have been made in the first place?
I'm sorry, can you state your question again?
That this was politically motivated somehow, the reason for the delay in the investigation. You made those statements. Should there be an apology, and were those reckless?
I said from the beginning that we need to ask the questions, and I don't think anybody should ever apologize for asking tough questions. We asked the questions. I promised a full, fair, comprehensive, and factual report, and that's exactly what we're giving you today.
Are you concerned about a potentially chilling effect at all on prosecutors who might be working on a potentially high-profile case in the future? Are you concerned about the possibility that they may think they have to press charges before a case might be ready because they're afraid of being the subject of another report in the future?
I was that prosecutor. I was the prosecutor who investigated and also brought to trial many child abuse cases, child sexual abuse cases. And I don't believe that any prosecutor whose main goal is to take a violent criminal off of the street while building a good case, I don't believe that their goal would ever be chilled by a case study and how we could do it better. If anything, this is in addition to the knowledge that they have, it's in addition to the training that they have, and it should never be a chilling effect. I think for the most part, they will be happy that we have looked at this case and we've looked at how to do it better and how to make children safer.
This report details missteps, miscommunication, missed opportunities. Who should be held accountable for that?
That's a good question. It appears as that the line prosecutor from the very beginning wanted, and as well as the agent and the troopers, wanted to conduct a search warrant, which was never done. It was declined, that it was rejected that they would be able to do a search warrant. It was the decision of the group to use a grand jury, and that's prosecutorial discretion. Some people would go that route. Some people wouldn't. But once you go that route, you have to use the tools of the grand jury that were offered. And as the report indicates, through long periods of 2009 and 2010, the grand jury resources were not used fully, as opposed to what happened in 2011. So it appears that the leadership of OAG, who was making the decisions, not the line prosecutor, had a real lack of urgency in taking Sandusky off of the streets, and also made some tactical errors that could have brought him off of the streets sooner.
You say the leadership, do you mean Tom Corbett?
Well, the leadership consisted of the chief of the criminal unit at the time, the chief of the criminal division at the time, the first deputy at the time, and the attorney general at the time.
General, you say, and you've said several times today, that there were crucial missteps, that there were inexplicable delays. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, are you saying that these occurred because of incompetence, and are you also, what were, if any, the negative impacts from this? Because it doesn't seem that the report points out any negative impacts about delays or lulls in the investigation, which you pointed out today.
Well, in terms of again, what I mentioned earlier, just to take first shot at answering the question, timeliness is important in these cases, right? It's important to consider, and the general has made this point, important to consider why things took as long as they did. In terms of consequences, the longer somebody like Jerry Sandusky is out and about, unouted to the public, the more risk he poses to the community. Was the case in 2011, when it was charged and tried in 2012, a rock-solid case against him? Sure. There were, and would it have been a tougher thing to do to charge him earlier if they didn't have any additional evidence? Yes, it would have. But that doesn't mean the right answer is to wait until the case is as strong as possible. So really, we're looking at the question going forward: how should investigators and prosecutors address these sorts of cases in the future?
That there were delays. I mean, are you saying that these prosecutors were not competent in doing this investigation, or what are you saying exactly?
I think, and I'm not going to talk about competence. What happened is things that should have happened. There are two sets of problems, right? There are investigative steps that were not taken until 2011 that could have been taken in 2009, and I think for some of those steps, maybe there was a rationale for that. I mean, one of the rationales offered was, well, we didn't want to go to Penn State, or to the local police department or Center County CYS, because if we did, then Penn State would find out about the investigation, and that might be bad. But on the other hand, there were decisions that were made that I think reasonable minds shouldn't differ about, like, for example, searching Sandusky's house. That could have happened in 2009, should have happened in 2009. So there are those sorts of decisions. There are also delays. Again, that March to August 2010 time period, not only was it a long time coming, the answer, but during that time, nobody was doing any investigation. Now, were they not doing anything? No, everybody was busy. The office, had a high workload. People were working on other cases, but they weren't pursuing this.
That in any type of long-term investigation, and can you sit here today and say definitively this was a good investigation or it was a bad investigation?
I was not asked to look at the question whether it was good or it was bad. What I was asked to do was to first find the facts. Why did it take as long as it did? And the report describes that. And then second, to see if there are ways in which we can help all of us learn better about how to handle these cases going forward. Good or bad is, that's people can read the report and make their own judgment. The final outcome was quite good. There's no doubt about that. In terms of the progress of the investigation, I think there are a lot of ways in which it could have been improved.
In the course of your investigation, did you become aware of any new victims who were alleging sexual abuse by Jerry Sandusky that happened after the case was transferred to the Office of Attorney General?
I think that was outside the scope of my responsibilities. My responsibilities were to look at what happened through charging in November 2011. I think there's an answer to that question from the office.
I'll take that. Yes, we do have two individuals who indicated that they were abused by Sandusky both in the fall of 2009.
Brad? Well, could you elaborate on that? I mean, what happened? Did you investigate those cases then?
Those cases were already known before I took office.
Well, the follow-up question I have is sort of on
Are they new victims? Yeah. Did he reoffend while the investigation was going on? Is that what you've now said?
The Office of Attorney General received the case in March of 2009, and two individuals indicated that they were abused by Sandusky sexually in the fall of 2009.
That figured in the prosecution?
They're not.
Well, are they going to be charges related to those two, or where do those cases stand?
Besides, as you all know, and as you also have the respect for the victims of child sexual abuse that we do, we don't want to give any identifying information for these individuals. Because Sandusky is in jail, there were also victims that we found that were not found previously, and those victims have indicated that because he is in jail and the appeal went well for the Office of Attorney General, they do not wish to prosecute at this time.
How many of those victims are there out there? So you said two, and then you just mentioned that there are even others. There are more.
Yes, but let's keep it straight. There's two separate questions here. There is a question as to whether anybody indicated that they were abused by Sandusky after the Office of Attorney General received the referral in March of 2009 and while Sandusky was walking the streets. The answer to that question is two individuals have indicated that they were abused by Sandusky in the fall of 2009. Your other question is, well, besides the victims that are already known and prosecuted, did Sandusky victimize even more, whether that was even in the 1990s? And the answer to that question is yes. But the victims that we know about as far as the fall of 2009, that's as far as we know.
2009, were they part of the civil litigation that you're aware of? Did they get remuneration of any sort?
Brad, I can't give you any more identifiable information about the victims.
A lot of the 5-month time lapse, the exchanges are captured in emails. Janelle Eschbach provide any more details about that conversation? Is there any other attempts to move the case forward?
Yeah, I think that everything that I thought was significant and relevant is contained in the report. So you've got the emails. We obviously interviewed Ms. Eschbach at great length. And so, by and large, you can see from the report what she said. I mean, for the most part, what we have is a series of emails from her, first to her immediate supervisors and then up the chain beyond that, asking when she was going to get an answer. And by and large, as she described it, those were chiefly her communications with those folks in terms of asking what was going on and when she was going to get an answer. And again, you've got all those emails in I think it's behind tab G.
Yes, about the two victims that indicated they were abused in fall of 2009, I just wanted to ask you, so was there any investigation done as to the credibility of those persons' allegations, and do you believe they're founded? Do you believe they were credible to the point where law enforcement could have pursued them? Because the reason I ask that is I remember that there was one story about somebody that came forward and it was indicated that it may not have been founded. And so can you tell me what your thoughts are about the credibility of those two allegations?
I'm not going to discuss the credibility of sexual abuse victims until they are found by a jury to be uncredible or incredible. The victims of sexual assault, when they tell us they're the victims of sexual assault, and unless we have anything to the contrary, we believe them.
Did anybody look at their cases? Did anybody attempt to prosecute them or take those basic steps to start to prosecute them? Because you said it was the prior team knew about it.
That's correct. They were known by the prior team. We found out about them when I came into office, and any other identifiable information, whether they were the part of a civil suit, whether the prior team made any decisions as to their credibility, I'm not going to discuss.
Mr. Moulton, can you elaborate on state police's role in your investigation, when they cooperated, didn't cooperate?
So obviously this was an investigation that began before it got to the Office of Attorney General. It began with a referral to the Pennsylvania State Police in November 2008 by the Clinton County Children and Youth Services. So there were, from the beginning, there was a state trooper assigned and a supervisor assigned. And then when we get to 2011, a bunch more folks from PSP were assigned. Very early on, I wanted to interview those folks, and I thought that was going to happen. I had a number of conversations with PSP's chief counsel, some of which were reduced to letters back and forth. Those letters are all in Appendix A to the report. In the end, they decided, to my disappointment, in the end they decided that they were not going to make their members available. Colonel Noonan, they did make available. I interviewed Colonel Noonan. His involvement in this case was mostly when he was at the Office of Attorney General, although obviously he became the commissioner and had a role over there as well. But in terms of the investigators, they did not make them available. They gave their reasons. Their principal reason is that they were concerned it was going to have might have an adverse effect on the pending trial, the still pending trial of against Spanier, Curley, and Schultz. You can see from the report that I disagree with that assessment. The folks at the Office of Attorney General who are prosecuting the case also disagree with that assessment. But again, I respect their decision. They made that decision, and it left us with some holes for sure. Having said that, thankfully, other investigators participated. PSP is pretty meticulous in preparing reports of the things they do, so we had their report, and we got to look at all that. So it was a problem, not an insurmountable one, and it was a disappointment. I did try later in the game, as late as May of this year, to ask them to reconsider their decision, and they stuck with it.
Hi, Mr. Moulton. As someone intimately familiar with the investigation as it played out, starting actually the timeline begins in the fall of 2008, is it conceivable to you that if the investigation had been executed at whatever level in a different way, that the two victims who say that they were abused or assaulted, in the fall of 2009, that either or both of those might not have happened?
Well, I think that lots of choices got made here. One of the choices that got made really both by the two district attorneys who had the case briefly and by the Office of Attorney General right at the beginning in March 2009, the choice was made that we're going to investigate further before we bring charges. Had that decision not been made, had he been charged right at the outset, then I don't know. I mean, if he'd been charged right at the outset, then there would have been a greater level of public awareness that he was a child molester. Now he was released on bail, as it turned out, in 2010. But sure, if the case had been charged sooner, it could have been charged. Could it have been charged before 2009? Yes, people could have made the decision to charge right away.
Did you find evidence that there was a discussion, that was a part of discussion, that people were saying, well, if there's evidence of this before and he's still at large, there might be the better part of that. The merit might be in just charging now. And
well, I think there's no, the people who were involved in the investigation, the investigators who spoke to us, and the prosecutors, all of whom spoke to us, were aware of the risk. Right? They were aware that he might be continuing to offend, and they hoped that the fact that he was aware of the investigation would make that less likely. And they concluded that the risk of a failed prosecution was greater than the risk posed by that. So they did have those discussions.
The Attorney General, could you ask, could the Attorney General answer that question, though? I mean, I know he's directed it to Mr. Bolton, but, I mean, isn't that a crucial question? Madam Attorney General, do you believe those victims who come forward in the fall of 2009 would not have been abused had this investigation gone more quickly?
If different steps were taken, if the course of action was taken that the search warrant would have been issued and executed, which could have been executed under seal right away, based upon the statements of victim one, then they would have found the corroborating evidence that they felt necessary for victim one. They also would have found the additional victims that they also felt necessary, would have made the case stronger. If that had happened, then Sandusky would have been charged earlier, no doubt. Now, prosecutors are you're going to have prosecutors coming out of the woodwork saying, well, we feel that the grand jury was the better choice. Okay, if you make that choice that the grand jury is the better choice and you go that route, then use the tools of the grand jury. You have to use all the tools necessary, because there's a real difference between making sure that the streets are safe from a sexual offender and building a winnable case. You have to make that decision. Different prosecutors make different decisions. I would have made a different decision.
And so the two people who come forward in the fall would not have been abused had they made the decision that you're now advocating.
Logically speaking, if different tactics were taken and a different route was chosen, and Sandusky was in jail with bail, by the way, if bail hadn't been that he was released on, with a cash amount, if he was in jail, of course, there wouldn't be more victims. Of course.
Saying that Tom Corbett mishandled the investigation and prosecution.
I am not saying that. I am saying that we have a factual report in front of us. This factual report indicates that there are long periods of time where nothing happened. There are long periods of delays that we can't explain. This report also indicates factually that key investigative steps were not taken early on. For example, the search warrant. And because of that, the case took longer than it could have or should have. What this report also indicates, this factual, unbiased report indicates that the reasons put forth, Mr. Moulton's reasons put forth of, well, why did they take these certain tactics? Why did they use the grand jury? Why did they not issue the search warrant? Indicates that there wasn't that sense of urgency to get Sandusky off of the streets that other prosecutors may have had, and therefore chosen different courses of action.
Hold on. We're going to take two more questions.
Sorry, I can't hear
you. We'll be available all day.
All stop with the Attorney General, please.
Listen, I can tell you what my leadership style is, and then it's going to be up to the public to decide. Different prosecutors have prosecutorial discretion. They do. That's the way it's got to be. Prosecutors are highly trained. I can tell you that I would not have done that differently, but that's my opinion. Jeff's factual report indicates that there were long periods of delays and there were investigative steps that weren't taken that could have given not only a different result, but could have done it in less period of time. I would have done it. I would have issued a search warrant. Whether that's, hold on one second. So the question was, does the buck stop with the Attorney General? The buck always stops with the leader. But in this case, don't forget, there was no direct evidence. There was no email. There was no confession. There was no statement that indicated that the Attorney General at the time did it for political reasons. What it appeared to be is that there was a lack of urgency on the part of leadership. Why? We don't know that. That's going to be up to the public to decide.
Steve, hold on. Steve,
why were so many troopers transferred off the case? Is that normal procedure, and is it normal procedure for the next trooper to re-interview the victim?
I think that's a better question for Mr. Moulton, since he went through the transfer of the troopers.
Yeah, there were several. You're right. At the beginning of this investigation, there were several troopers assigned as the initial as the lead investigator. First one, Trooper Kavanaugh, was involved for several months. It was then transferred to another trooper, and then by May 2009, Trooper Scott Rossman was assigned, and he was involved in the case through most of the rest of the investigation. In terms of why that happened, that unfortunately is something. The transfers are something that I don't have the answer to because I couldn't interview those folks.
Victims in the report. Yeah. Why isn't it in the report? If it is that significant, and although I'm confused about what you're saying about the timeline, are you saying prosecutors at the time knew about these victims, didn't investigate them, didn't look into? Why isn't that in the report if that's what you're saying here?
I'm assuming that question is directed to me, or would you rather Mr. Moulton?
So let me just take on the factual side of things. First, the Office of Attorney General is entirely separate from my project. Was, as the Attorney General has said, was looking at the question of were there additional victims, should there additional charges be brought, et cetera. With respect to the victims that she's mentioned, the people who allege that they were victimized in the fall of 2009, I think my understanding of the facts is that those are folks who, during the course of the investigation, and I think not before 2011, investigators learned about. So I don't think there's no suggestion that folks knew in the fall of 2009 that these additional victims existed. They believed there were additional victims, but they didn't come to light until 2011. The investigation, as far as I'm aware, the investigation was not aware of any additional victim besides victim one until the Mike McQuarrie. That was the first one.
Mr. Moulton, General, you painted a fairly specific picture of then Attorney General Corbett's involvement here, saying he never made any substantial decisions on the conduct of the investigation.
John, can you speak?
I'm sorry, you painted a fairly specific picture, saying that then Attorney General Corbett never made any substantive decisions related to the conduct of this investigation. Is that standard? Is that a standard way for an incumbent Attorney General to operate, or does that paint a picture of him as a disengaged manager from the affairs of his office?
First of all, the statement, your statement of the involvement of then Attorney General comes directly from this report. So just so that we're clear on that. And you're asking me what my personal opinion of how an Attorney General should operate is. And, you know, you're going to get at least 50 different opinions on how Attorney General should operate. And that's not up to me to decide. I can tell you how I operate. I can tell you, you know, how I go about things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that someone else does it the wrong way. That's up to the public to decide. The public chooses their leaders. It's up to you to decide what style of leadership you believe is best serves the public.
All right, we can take your questions afterwards. You have our contact information at the bottom of the release. Then we're going to wrap up for now. We're getting a little repetitive. So.
Well, I have one. Could I just ask you, you talked about people within the investigation who speculated that politics were involved. I haven't come across any names or references to agencies that they were involved with. Did that come from the state police or agents in the
All of the information that I think is appropriate for me to provide about that is in the report.
We'll follow up.
Thank you. I would love to sit here all day and answer your questions, but I will tell you that I have another pressing matter that deals with the welfare of thousands of Pennsylvanians. We have quite a bit going on, but however, I will recommend that you do read the entire report. The reason that we didn't come out in the beginning and put out dribs and drabs is because you need a comprehensive report. So I encourage you and the public to read the entire report. As JJ has indicated, we're not going anywhere. We will be available for your questions, and we'd like to answer as many as we possibly can. Thank you. Thank you.
And then there's sitting Governor Tom Corbett right now. And this is a big story in Pennsylvania. It's not a big national story, and this is a real problem. Tom Corbett is currently on the Board of Trustees.
He's the Pennsylvania governor.
Yes, he is the former state's attorney general of the state of Pennsylvania. Over the course of 2 years, he had the information about Jerry Sandusky, and based on who you believe, he either assigned one person to the case, or his office responds and says, that's an outrage. We actually assigned 2 people to the case. And over 2 years, they basically did nothing. It's called in Pennsylvania the slow-walking indictment. And the reason why that a lot of people, including entities like ESPN, which is hardly democracy now, why they have inferred that why he did this was that he was in the process of raising a lot of money for his gubernatorial run from Penn State alums and from the board of Jerry Sandusky's charity, Second Mile. He held fundraisers without alerting Second Mile that Jerry Sandusky was under investigation at the head of the board of directors of this incredibly large child charity service called Second Mile. And the idea that Tom Corbett has not had to answer for these questions is very problematic to a lot of people in Pennsylvania.
Speaking to PAMatters.com earlier this month, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Corbett defended himself against accusations that the 3-year investigation should have been opened and concluded earlier. Corbett launched the criminal investigation against Sandusky, as you said, Dave, while he was Attorney General of Pennsylvania.
There has been criticism in the past of why I didn't charge right after the very first report, and that would be the young man from Clinton County. And I think it's clear now, and especially if you talk to victim advocates and people that have done this kind of work, that very hard in a one-on-one case. But when you present a series of victims, and the consistency in the testimony. Not absolute consistency, but consistency in demonstrating the modus operandi, for want of a better term, of Mr. Sandusky. Thank you. I'm trying to blot the name out.
I don't blame you. I think we all are.
That this investigation was conducted in order to get somebody off the street, not to lose the investigation, and we were successful.
That was Pennsylvania Governor Tom Corbett. Dave Zirin, your response.
My response is that he needs to explain the $650,000, and once again, I get that number from ESPN, that he raised from the board of directors of Jerry Sandusky's foundation, Second Mile, while he was running for governor. My response is to ask why more investigators weren't put on this incredibly important case. It's so hegemonic culturally in this section of Pennsylvania, so hegemonic financially, so hegemonic emotionally, culturally, and the fact that it really looks like Tom Corbett did not want to really go there, even if it meant the fact that more children could be victimized over the course of his investigation. What's most problematic to me, Amy, is that Tom Corbett played a huge role in getting Louis Freeh to do this investigation. He vouched for Louis Freeh. He considers Louis Freeh a friend. And the idea that Tom Corbett has not had to answer himself under subpoena for why he did what he did, I mean, it's one of those things where, look who we're attacking right now. We're attacking 18-year-old scholarship athletes and making them pay the price when people in power have not really had to be affected or afflicted by the horrible crimes that took place in Happy Valley.
Dave Zirin, explain the significance of the Second Mile Foundation and the significance of Sandusky having to leave Penn State but giving the rights to the locker room.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, and this has to be a part of the story, because Second Mile started as a small children's charity for underprivileged children that was started by Jerry Sandusky. He wrote a book about why this charity was going to become his life's work after he left football. The book, disturbingly enough, was self-published, and it's called Touched. The Jerry Sandusky story, and people have wondered whether that was part of his own just horrible approach to children, is why he called it Touched. Jerry Sandusky was somebody who then took this children's charity, Second Mile, and turned it into something, through his connections at Penn State, that was this incredibly powerful entity, this incredibly powerful nonprofit that had its tentacles reach throughout the state of Pennsylvania. And it also looks like it was the place where Jerry Sandusky chose his victims on the basis of how vulnerable they were, on the basis of how poor their economic situation was, on the basis of them not having other adults in their lives who would listen to them. I mean, it's about, reading through the court testimony as Sandusky's trial took place, and he was convicted on 45 of 48 counts, 700 years behind bars. It couldn't have been more diabolical, and it couldn't have been more disturbing about how these children were exploited over the course of so many years. And Second Mile was also something that was supported greatly by Penn State University, and it looks to be very much that it was a condition of keeping what Sandusky was doing quiet, was making sure that the charity was funded and making sure it would kind of just be kept quiet and all go away for the purposes of protecting the brand. I mean, this is banality of evil writ large. I mean, you have this horrible monster at the center of it in Jerry Sandusky, and then you have layers and layers and layers of people in power who are scared about what his scandal would do to them, even if the collateral damage was small children. And it's this horror show why a lot of people, I think, are celebrating what the NCAA did. But I would turn back once again to the Naomi Klein concept of the shock doctrine, and really we should be worried about the kind of power that the NCAA is assuming in what really should be a criminal and civil manner.
We need to identify these victims of sexual abuse. We need to find them. We need to help them. They are our children.
There have also been a lot of questions about the Second Mile, the charity that Mr. Sandusky acquired, and how they had handled this matter. Had founded. Were you familiar with the Second Mile, and do you have any concerns about how they handled the information that they had about Mr. Sandusky?
I am familiar with the Second Mile. I believe there will be inquiry as to, first off, what information they had. Since the Attorney General has not done anything there yet in that respect, and charities do come under the purview of the Attorney General in a different section of the Attorney General's office, I make that as an observation, not as a conclusion. I think that relationships between outside charities and the university certainly have to be looked at, and I'm sure that that committee will look at it.
Do you have concerns about the way the charity officials handled this matter?
I don't know how they handled it, so I can't say that I have concerns. That has to be determined what, if anything, they knew about this. I have not seen, and I don't think any of you have seen, anything that anybody other than one individual connected with the charity. One individual had any knowledge.
And also the general counsel of the university was also the general counsel for the charity.
Again, I need to know what the charity, what the board members knew. And I think that's a determination that people will be looking into.
Do you feel that the system is being abused to protect certain people?
I knew that I was walking into public corruption, which again is why I ran. But I will tell you this, even I am shocked at the level of public corruption. I am shocked at how deep it goes, and I am shocked at how powerful it is. I have never seen anything like this. It's breathtaking. It has been described by the people familiar with what is happening as shameful.
We must keep in mind that when it comes to the safety of children, there can be no margin for error, no hesitation to act. That we need to protect children, we need to act. Unfortunately, in my career, particularly as Attorney General, I've seen many instances where people who have power believe that they're beyond the law. Your actions speak much louder than your words.